but you're holding your breath. It was the first time in a year someone had seen through his armor. Elias found himself at a crossroads. For months, he had been the master of the fortress. He knew how to be alone. He knew how to be successful, but he didn't know how to be intertwined. When he and Clara started spending time together, his old survival instincts began to scream. One night, they were sitting in a small bistro. Clara reached across the table to move a stray hair from his forehead. Elias flinched. It wasn't because he didn't like her. It was because his brain had been hardwired to associate closeness with impending catastrophe. "You're waiting for the other shoe to drop, aren't you?" Clara asked gently. "I've worked hard for this piece," Elias admitted, his voice tight. "When you're with someone, you give them the power to take that piece away. I don't know if I'm ready to hand over that kind of leverage again." This is the relational ghost phase. Even when the ex is long gone, the patterns they left behind remain like scar tissue. Elias realized he was projecting his past onto his present. He was treating Clara like a potential Sarah. He was looking for red flags that didn't exist, trying to solve a relationship that hadn't even started. I told him, "Elias, you're trying to drive a car while staring at the rearview mirror. You're going to crash into what's right in front of you because you're so worried about what's behind you. The success you found in your career was built on risk. Why are you trying to play it safe with your heart?" He realized that his success was incomplete. He had become a mountain, high, majestic, and solitary. But even mountains have ecosystems. To be truly successful in life, you have to be able to share the view. Elias decided to try a new experiment: transparent vulnerability. Instead of hiding his fear from Clara, he told her about it. He told her, "I'm scared that if I get close to you, I'll lose the person I worked so hard to become. I'm scared I'll start drinking dark roast coffee again just because you like it." Clara laughed, but it wasn't a mean laugh. "Elias," she said, "I don't want a version of me. I want the guy who plays the guitar with 5 strings and cries into his onions. If you start changing for me, I'll be the one to leave, because then the man I liked will be gone." That was the moment the mirror shifted. Elias realized that a healthy relationship isn't 2 halves becoming a whole, it's 2 wholes sharing a path. He didn't have to shrink to fit into Clara's life, and she didn't have to be his sun. They could just be 2 stars in the same galaxy. But as he let Clara in, he realized his professional life was about to face its biggest challenge yet. The company he worked for was being sold, and his perfect job was on the line. He was about to find out if his inner strength was tied to his title, or if it was truly part of his soul. In Part 8, we're going to talk about the collapse of the external. What happens when the success you built as a distraction starts to crumble, and you have to decide what's worth saving.
Part 8. The collapse of the external. The acquisition was swift and cold. Within 48 hours, redundancy became the word of the day. Elias, the man who had poured every ounce of his post-breakup energy into his career, sat across from a consultant who didn't know his name, only a salary number. "We're moving in a different direction," the consultant said. Just like that, the senior creative director was gone. Elias walked out of the building with his things in a cardboard box, the same way he had walked out of his old life with Sarah. The irony was a bitter pill. He had used his job as a shield against his emotions, and now the shield had shattered. He sat in his car, the box in the passenger seat. He felt that familiar, hollow ache in his chest. His first instinct was to spiral. "I'm a failure. First her, now this. I'm cursed." He waited for the panic attack, for the 3 a.m. darkness to swallow him whole. But something was different this time. He looked at his hands on the steering wheel. They weren't shaking. He realized that while the job was gone, the skills he used to get it weren't. The resilience he had developed while learning to eat alone, the discipline he had gained at the gym, and the raw honesty he had found in his music, those weren't company property. They were integrated into his DNA. The job was just a suit of armor, I told him that night. He was sitting on his floor, surrounded by his awards and portfolios. "You're upset because you think you've lost your identity again. But look around. Did you lose your ability to write a melody? Did you lose your eye for design? Did you lose the fact that you survived the worst day of your life 6 months ago?" Elias looked at the cardboard box. "No," he said. "I just lost the desk." This is the core strength phase. Most people think success is a destination, a specific job, or a specific partner. But true success is the internal infrastructure that allows you to rebuild, no matter how many times the external world burns down. Elias was about to prove that he wasn't a creative director who happened to be a man. He was a man who happened to be creative. Instead of hunting for another safe corporate job, Elias did something radical. He decided to leverage his failure. He took his severance pay and rented a tiny, rundown studio in an industrial part of town. He didn't tell Clara he was unemployed. He told her he was launching. He stopped working for a brand and started becoming one. The first month was terrifying. There were no health benefits, no catered lunches, and no secretary. It was just him, his guitar, and his laptop. He spent 14 hours a day reaching out to the human connections he had made in Part 6. He realized that because he had treated people with empathy when he was at the top, they were willing to help him while he was at the bottom. One of his former junior designers, Maya, reached out. "I heard what happened. I'm freelancing now. If you need a hand with your first big client, I'm in. I haven't forgotten how you stood up for me." Elias realized that his vulnerability from the previous chapter had actually been an investment. He wasn't alone. He was part of a tribe he didn't even know he had built. But as the business started to crawl towards its first contract, Elias faced a new internal demon, the comparison trap. He saw a post online. Yes, he had unblocked the view, but not the person, and saw that Sarah had just gotten engaged. In the middle of his professional collapse, the past threw one last punch. In Part 9, we're going to talk about the final comparison, how Elias dealt with the news of her perfect life while his own was in a state of chaotic reconstruction, and the moment he finally stopped measuring his clock against hers. The news of the engagement felt like a physical weight, a cold draft entering a room he thought he'd finally sealed shut. It wasn't that he wanted her back. He knew with every fiber of his being that they were a closed book. It was the velocity of it. He was sitting in a dusty, half-furnished studio, eating cold noodles and trying to figure out how to pay his business insurance, while she was picking out a ring. This is Part 9, the final comparison. Part 9, the final comparison. Elias spent a night staring at the ceiling. The old, familiar questions tried to crawl back into his head. Was I just a placeholder? How did she move so fast? Is he better than me? This is the ego death phase. When you see your past partner reaching milestones you once envisioned for yourself, it feels like they won the race while you're still tying your shoes. "She's happy, Elias," I told him the next morning, "and that has absolutely nothing to do with your value. Her timeline is not a critique of yours." "But it feels like I'm behind," Elias argued. "I'm starting a business from scratch, I'm technically broke, and she's moving on to the forever part." I sat him down. "Listen to me. Life is not a race against others. It's a series of seasons. She is in a season of harvest. You are in a season of planting. You cannot compare your seeds to her fruit. If you do, you'll dig up your own seeds before they have a chance to grow just to see if they're still there." Elias realized that his obsession with her win was actually a distraction from his own potential. He was looking at her highlight reel while ignoring his own transformation. He looked around his dusty studio. Yes, it was small. Yes, it was scary, but it was his. For the first time, he wasn't building a life to impress a woman or a corporate board. He was building it because he had something to say. He took that energy, that raw, competitive, I'll show them fire, and he refined it. He didn't use it to stalk her social media. He used it to stay up until 4 a.m. perfecting the brand identity for his first client. He used it to write the lyrics for a song called "The Ghost of the Clock," about the lie we tell ourselves that we're running out of time. The turning point came when his first major contract was signed. It wasn't a corporate giant. It was a local nonprofit that needed a voice.
They couldn't pay him 6 figures, but they gave him something better: creative freedom. When he finished the project, he didn't check his phone to see if Sarah would see it. He didn't care if the old crowd approved. He felt a deep, quiet hum of satisfaction in his own gut. He had created something out of nothing. He had turned his failure into a foundation. He walked to the window of his studio. The sun was setting over the industrial skyline. He called Clara. "Hey, I just signed my first deal. It's not a lot, but it's a start. Do you want to come over? I've got some cheap wine and a lot of ideas." Clara came over. They sat on the floor, surrounded by sketches and guitar cables. And for the first time in years, Elias wasn't thinking about the next 10 years. He wasn't thinking about forever. He was just there, in the moment, with a woman who liked him for his scars, not his titles. He was no longer moving on. He was moving forward. But as his business began to gain traction, Elias realized he was becoming a workaholic again. He was replacing his old addiction to a person with a new addiction to the grind. He was about to learn that success isn't just about how much you build. It's about whether you have the soul left to enjoy it. In part 10, we're going to talk about the Sabbath of the soul, how Elias had to learn to stop running and realize that he had already arrived.
Part 10. The Sabbath of the Soul. Success has a shadow, and for Elias, that shadow was burnout. He had used the grind as a painkiller. As long as he was busy, he didn't have to feel the residual ache of the past. But your body and your spirit have a way of demanding payment for the loans you take out on your health. One Thursday afternoon, right in the middle of a high-stakes presentation for a new client, Elias's vision blurred. His heart started to skip beats. Not the flutter of excitement, but the heavy, thudding warning of exhaustion. He had to excuse himself. He sat in the bathroom stall, head in his hands, realized he was utterly, profoundly empty. "I can't keep this pace," he told me later that night. He looked gray. "I thought this was what making it looked like. I thought being successful meant being invincible." "No," I said. "Being successful means being sustainable. You've built a beautiful car, Elias, but you're driving it at 120 miles per hour in first gear. You're going to blow the engine. You're still running away from the breakup even though the breakup is miles behind you. You're running because you're afraid that if you sit still, you'll realize you're still just a person." This is the stillness phase. It's the hardest part for high achievers. It requires you to decouple your value from your output. I gave him a task that felt harder than starting his business: a day of nothing. No phone, no guitar, no strategy sessions, no Clara. Just Elias, sitting in his apartment, being a human being. He fought me on it. "I'll lose momentum. My competitors will catch up." "Let them," I said. "A forest that never rests eventually turns to dust. You need a fallow season." That Sunday, Elias sat on his balcony. For the first 4 hours, he was miserable. He felt itchy. He felt guilty. He kept reaching for a phone that wasn't there. He felt the ghost of the clock whispering that he was wasting time. He felt the old fear that if he wasn't achieving, he was failing. But around the 6th hour, something shifted. He started noticing the way the light hit the brick building across the street. He heard the sound of a neighbor's wind chime. He watched a hawk circle the city thermals. He started to breathe, really breathe into the bottom of his lungs. He realized a profound truth. He was enough, even if he did nothing. The man Sarah left was gone. The man who was senior creative director was gone. The man who was struggling entrepreneur was just a role. Beneath it all was Elias, a man who liked the sun on his skin, who had a good heart, and who had survived. He didn't need $1 million or a wedding ring to justify his existence on the planet. When he finally turned his phone back on Monday morning, the world hadn't ended. His clients hadn't vanished. In fact, he looked at his work with fresh eyes and realized he had been overcomplicating everything because he was trying too hard to impress people who didn't matter. He went to the studio and deleted half of the busy work on his plate. He called Maya and gave her more responsibility, trusting her to lead. He called Clara and told her, "I'm taking next weekend off. Let's go to the mountains.
No phones, just trees. This was the moment Elias moved from success to wholeness. He was no longer a man trying to fill a hole in his heart with accolades. The hole had closed, not because it was filled with stuff, but because the tissue had finally healed over. He was now ready for the next level. But as he settled into this new peace, a new challenge emerged. His business was growing so fast that he was no longer a one-man show. He had to become a mentor. He had to learn how to lead others through their own Part 1s. In Part 11, we're going to talk about the mirror of the apprentice, how Elias dealt with hiring his first employee who was going through a devastating loss, and how he had to decide if he was ready to be the person he once needed. Part 11, the mirror of the apprentice. Elias found Leo in the break room, staring at a cup of coffee that had gone cold. It was a scene Elias knew by heart. The slumped shoulders, the 1,000-yard stare, the aura of a person who has just had their world dismantled. "She left," Leo whispered without looking up. 5 years. We had a dog, Elias. We were looking at houses. And this morning, she said she hasn't loved me in a year. The office was busy. Phones were ringing, and a deadline for a major campaign was looming. The professional Elias of Part 6 would have told Leo to take a personal day and come back when he was ready to produce. But the whole Elias looked at the young man and saw a ghost of himself. He realized that his success wasn't just about the money in his bank or the music on the radio. It was about the wisdom he had accumulated during his own trek through the fire. "Come with me," Elias said. He didn't take Leo to a conference room. He took him for a walk. "I'm going to tell you something you won't believe," as they walked through the city park. "Right now, you feel like you're dying. You feel like your future has been stolen. You're going to go home, and the silence in your apartment is going to feel like it's crushing your lungs. You'll want to call her. You'll want to ask why. You'll want to check her Instagram to see if she's hurting too." Leo looked at him shocked. "How do you know exactly what I'm thinking?" "Because I am the future version of you, and I'm telling you that you're about to enter the most important year of your life. This pain is a fertilizer. It's disgusting, it smells, and it's heavy. But if you sit in it and let it work, you're going to grow into a version of yourself that the current you wouldn't even recognize." Elias became a mentor. He didn't just teach Leo how to use design software, he taught him how to manage his nervous system. He enforced the no-contact rule for Leo. He encouraged him to join the same gym Elias went to. He gave him projects that required Leo to channel his grief into color and shape. Through Leo, Elias saw his own progress in high definition. He realized how far he had come. He could talk about breakups, pain, and loss without his own heart rate spiking. He was no longer a victim of his story. He was the author of it, and he was teaching someone else how to hold the pen. "Success," Elias wrote in his journal that night, "is not about how high you climb. It's about how many people you reach back and pull up with you." The agency flourished under this new culture. It wasn't just a place of work, it was a place of humanity. Clients began to notice that Elias's team had a soul that other agencies lacked. They weren't just selling products, they were telling stories that felt real. But as Elias poured himself into mentoring Leo and growing the business, a letter arrived at his office. It wasn't from an ex, and it wasn't from a client. It was a legal notice. The senior creative role he had been fired from in Part 8 was involved in a massive lawsuit regarding a project he had worked on right before he left. He was being called back to the very place that had broken him, but this time he wasn't an employee. He was a witness. In Part 12, we're going to talk about the return to the ruins, how Elias had to walk back into the building that once felt like his prison, and the moment he realized he was finally, truly untouchable. Part 12, the return to the ruins. For a moment, the old Elias, the one who felt small, replaceable, and broken, tried to take the wheel. His stomach did a familiar flip. He remembered the coldness of that glass building, the way the fluorescent lights seemed to highlight his every insecurity, and the way the "we're moving in a different direction" speech had shattered his remaining self-worth. "I don't want to go back there," he told me. "That building represents the worst year of my life. It's where my relationship died, and it's where my career was executed." "Elias," I said, "you aren't going back as the victim. You're going back as the evidence. You are going back to show that building that it didn't win. This isn't a haunt, it's a victory lap." The day of the deposition arrived. Elias dressed with care, not to impress them, but to respect the man he had become. He wore a suit that fit perfectly, but he left the tie at home. He looked like exactly what he was, a successful, independent founder who didn't answer to anyone in that building. As he walked through the revolving glass doors, the smell of the lobby, a mix of expensive floor wax and recycled air, hit him. Usually a scent like that would trigger a wave of anxiety, but as he stood in the elevator, he realized something miraculous. He felt nothing. No anger, no fear, no "I'll show them." Just a calm, clinical observation of a place that no longer had any power over him. He was ushered into a high-tech boardroom. Across the table sat the very executives who had fired him. They looked tired. They looked gray. They were surrounded by lawyers and stacks of paper, fighting for their professional lives. When they looked at Elias, they didn't see a redundant employee. They saw a man who was vibrant, healthy, and, most terrifyingly for them, free. For 3 hours, Elias answered questions with a precision that was devastating. He didn't embellish. He didn't try to get revenge. He simply told the truth. He spoke about the corners they had cut and the warnings he had given that they had ignored. At one point, the lead attorney for the conglomerate tried to rattle him. "Mr. Elias, isn't it true you were terminated for performance issues shortly after this project?" The room went silent. The executives looked down at their legal pads. This was the moment they expected him to flinch, to become defensive, to let the old breakup shame leak out. Elias smiled. It was a genuine, warm smile. "No," he said calmly, "I was let go because the company was shifting its culture. And honestly, it was the best thing that ever happened to me. If I hadn't been pushed out of this door, I might still be sitting in that office, as miserable as the people across from me are right now. You didn't fire me. You released me." The attorney had no follow-up. When the deposition was over, Elias walked out of the boardroom. He passed his old office. A stranger was sitting there now, looking stressed and hunched over a keyboard. Elias felt a genuine compassion for that person, but he didn't stop. He kept walking. He reached the lobby, walked through the glass doors, and stepped out into the afternoon sun. He took a deep breath of the city air, exhaust, street food, and all. It smelled like liberty. He realized that the ruins weren't ruins anymore. They were just a building. The ghosts had all moved out because he had stopped feeding them. He had returned to the place that broke him and realized that he was now too big to fit inside its walls. He called Leo, his apprentice. "Hey Leo, I'm heading back to the studio. Clear my schedule for the last hour of the day. We're going to celebrate." "Celebrate what?" Leo asked. "The fact that the past is a ghost, and ghosts can't trip you unless you're looking back," Elias said. But as Elias felt the ultimate closure of his professional past, a new, more personal door was about to creak open. He was about to receive an invitation that would test his new relationship with Clara and his ability to truly forgive. In Part 13, we're going to talk about the wedding of the ghost. What happened when Elias received an invitation to Sarah's wedding, and the radical choice he made that defined his final stage of healing. Part 13. The Wedding of the Ghost. Elias held the card in his kitchen. For the first time in a year, he didn't feel a spike of adrenaline or a wave of nausea. He felt a strange, quiet sense of irony. Included with the invitation was a small, handwritten note. "Elias, I know this might be strange, but you were such a huge part of my life, and seeing how much you've grown from afar has made me realize how much we both needed that ending. I'd love for you to be there, not as an ex, but as a friend who made it through to the other side." This is the validation trap. It is the ultimate breadcrumb. On the surface, it looked like a beautiful gesture of maturity, but deep down, it was a request for Elias to bless her new life, to prove he was okay so she could stop feeling guilty about how it ended.
"Are you going?" I asked him. We were at his studio, and he was spinning the invitation on his desk. "A year ago, I would have gone just to show off," Elias admitted. "I would have brought Clara, worn my most expensive watch, and tried to be the most successful person in the room just to make her regret it. But now, the idea of sitting in a church watching her marry someone else feels unnecessary." "Why is it unnecessary?" "Because," he said, looking at the card, "I don't need her to see that I'm okay. I already know I'm okay, and I don't need to witness her happiness to prove I've forgiven her. True forgiveness isn't about standing in the same room. It's about no longer needing to be in the story at all." This is the final boundary phase. Elias realized that moving on didn't mean becoming friends with the person who broke him. Sometimes moving on means recognizing that the bridge between two people has burned down, and that's okay. You don't have to rebuild it just to prove you aren't afraid of the fire. He sat down with Clara that evening and showed her the invitation. He wanted to be transparent. "Do you want to go?" Clara asked. She wasn't jealous, she was observant. She wanted to see if the ghost of Sarah still had a seat at their table. "No," Elias said. "Going to that wedding would be like visiting a museum of a life I don't live anymore. I'm not angry, and I'm not sad. I'm just finished." Elias sent a gift, a piece of art from the gallery where he met Clara, with a simple note wishing them a lifetime of peace. He didn't send a long letter. He didn't attend the ceremony. He chose to spend that Saturday taking Clara on a hike in the mountains, disconnected from the grid, breathing in the air of the present. As they stood at the summit, looking out over the valley, Elias realized that he had reached the zenith of emotional autonomy. He had been offered the chance to step back into the past, and he had politely declined. He had finally realized that his success wasn't a performance for his ex-partner. It was a gift to himself. He was no longer Elias, the guy who got dumped. He was no longer Elias, the guy who showed her. He was just Elias. However, as the sun set over the mountains, a new thought entered his mind. He had spent so much time rebuilding his own life that he hadn't noticed a shift in the world around him. His business was so successful that he was being approached for a global expansion. He was about to move from a local success story to a world-class leader, and he had to decide if he was ready for the weight of that crown. In part 14, we're going to talk about the burden of the crown, how Elias dealt with the pressure of high-level success, and the moment he realized that the bigger your life gets, the more important your inner smallness becomes. Part 14. The Burden of the Crown. When the contract landed on his desk, Elias felt a cold sweat. This wasn't the fight or flight of a breakup. This was the imposter syndrome of the successful. He looked at the numbers and the expectations, and for a split second, he felt like that guy on the floor of his kitchen again, helpless and small. He realized that the bigger his life became, the more he risked losing the inner smallness that kept him grounded. "If I sign this," he told me, "I'm not just a designer anymore. I'm a CEO. I'm responsible for 100 families' paychecks. What if I mess up? What if the version of me that survived the breakup isn't strong enough to lead a global empire?" "Elias," I said, "the reason you were offered this contract is precisely because of what you survived. These corporate giants have plenty of people who can follow a process. They want you because you have the scars of a man who knows how to rebuild when everything falls apart. They aren't buying your talent, they're buying your resilience." This is the wait phase. Success is often depicted as a light, airy thing, but in reality, it is heavy. It requires you to make decisions that affect people you'll never meet. Elias spent a week in deep contemplation. He realized he was afraid of outgrowing himself. He was afraid that if he became a king, he would forget how to be the man who cried into his onions. He decided to sign the contract, but with a condition of the soul. He wouldn't change his office. He wouldn't buy a private jet. He wouldn't stop mentoring Leo. He called a mandatory meeting for his team. "We're going global," he announced.
The room erupted in cheers, but Elias raised his hand for silence. But here's the rule. We don't become corporate. We don't lose the human touch. We are going to scale our empathy, not just our profits. If we ever start making decisions based on spreadsheets instead of souls, we've lost. He was learning that true power isn't about control, it's about stewardship. He used his new wealth to start a foundation for young artists going through personal crises. He turned his pain into a scholarship. He was no longer just a successful man, he was becoming a pillar. But as the global project launched, the pressure reached an all-time high. Elias was traveling between London, Tokyo, and New York. He was barely seeing Clara. He was becoming a ghost of success, present in every boardroom, but absent in his own life. He realized that the burden of the crown wasn't the work itself, it was the temptation to sacrifice the very me he had worked so hard to find in part 3. One night in a hotel room in Singapore, looking out at a city he didn't recognize, Elias felt a wave of profound loneliness. It wasn't the "I miss Sarah" loneliness, it was the "I miss my life" loneliness. He realized that he had moved on from his breakup, but he was now in danger of moving on from himself. He picked up his guitar, the one he still carried in a battered case, and played a single, quiet chord. The sound reminded him of where he came from. He realized that success is a beautiful view, but if you stay on the mountain too long, you freeze. He made a radical decision. He called his board of directors and told them he was appointing Maya and Leo as co-creative leads for the global project. He was stepping back to be the visionary, not the manager of everything. "I'm going home," he told them. In part 15, we're going to talk about the return to the center, how Elias learned that the ultimate success isn't more, but enough, and the surprising person he ran into at a local park who brought his entire journey full circle. Part 15. The Return to the Center. The first thing Elias did upon his return was go back to the park where we had sat during his darkest days. It was a crisp autumn afternoon, the kind where the air feels thin and clean. He sat on the same wooden bench where he had once told me his hands wouldn't stop shaking. He felt a deep, resonant sense of peace. He wasn't checking his phone. He wasn't thinking about the Tokyo rebranding or the New York board meeting. He was just watching a young father try to teach a toddler how to kick a ball. "You look different," a voice said from beside him. Elias turned. It wasn't me. It wasn't Clara. It was a man he vaguely recognized from his old life, a former co-worker from the conglomerate, a man named Marcus, who had been part of the "we're moving in a different direction" era. Marcus looked tired. He looked like a man who was still carrying the weight Elias had just put down. "I heard about your agency, Elias. Everyone in the industry is talking about it. You really showed them, didn't you?" Elias looked at Marcus and realized that Marcus was still living in the revenge mindset of part 2. Marcus thought the goal was to show them. "Actually," Elias said softly, "the more I focused on showing them, the more miserable I was. I didn't find success until I stopped looking at them entirely and started looking at the work. And then, eventually, I had to stop looking at the work and start looking at my life." They talked for an hour. Elias realized that he had become a living bridge. He was no longer the broken man on the bench. He was the man who could show others how to get off the bench. He saw in Marcus the same ghost of the identity he had faced. "The secret, Marcus," Elias said, "is that the breakup, the firing, the failures, they weren't the end of your life. They were the end of your illusions. Once you realize you can survive the worst, you become the most dangerous person in the room because you have nothing left to fear." As Marcus walked away, looking a little lighter, Elias felt a final piece of the puzzle click into place. He realized that his journey from part 1 to part 15 hadn't been about moving on from a woman, It had been about moving into himself. The center wasn't a place, it was a state of being where his worth wasn't tied to a partner, a paycheck, or a performance. He got up from the bench and began to walk home. But as he turned the corner near his favorite local bookstore, he saw something, or rather a person that he hadn't expected to see in the flesh again. Standing by the window, looking at a display of poetry, was Sarah. For the first time since the breadcrumb and the wedding invitation, they were in the same physical space. There were no screens, no lawyers, and no memories to hide behind. This is the moment every heartbroken person dreams and every healed person fears. In part 16, we're going to talk about the neutrality of the past, the conversation that happened in that bookstore, and the moment Elias realized that the woman he once thought was his everything was now just a stranger he happened to know very well.